I still remember the moment I opened my email and saw messages from fellow gun owners. My NFA eForm just froze. What's happening? Less than a year ago, we were celebrating one of the most efficient changes ever made by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, a near-instant approval process for NFA-regulated items like suppressors, short-barreled rifles, and machine guns. It was the first time in decades that lawful gun owners felt like the system was finally working for them. Then came the 2025 federal government shutdown, and overnight, that progress disappeared. In the eyes of the federal government, processing NFA applications suddenly became a non-essential service. In other words, the constitutional rights of millions of law-abiding Americans were paused because of budget politics in Washington, D.C. For context, the National Firearms Act, NFA, passed in 1934, regulates the transfer and ownership of certain firearms classified as Title II weapons. Every transaction requires approval through the ATF's NFA division, typically funded by the $200 transfer tax that applicants pay for each item. The system was designed to ensure accountability, not to serve as a political pawn. Yet, during the shutdown, that's exactly what happened. I found it astonishing that a process fully funded by user fees, not dependent on congressional appropriations, could still be halted. It revealed something much deeper about how our rights are managed and sometimes mismanaged by the very institutions meant to uphold them. In this video, I want to break down exactly what happened, how the shutdown froze the NFA process, why it matters for every legal firearm owner, and how organizations like the National Shooting Sports Foundation, NSSF, fought to restore this system. More importantly, I'll explain what this means for the future, because this wasn't just a temporary glitch. It's a glimpse into how fragile our rights can become when bureaucracy replaces accountability. So, let's unpack this. When people talk about the National Firearms Act, NFA, they usually think of long wait times, stacks of paperwork, and outdated bureaucracy. For decades, buying an NFA-regulated item, whether a suppressor, short-barreled rifle, or machine gun, meant enduring months of silence after submitting fingerprints, tax payments, and Form 4s to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. It was slow, painful, and for many, discouraging. That changed dramatically in early 2024. The ATF launched a modernized eForm system, an electronic platform designed to automate background checks and streamline submissions. For the first time in years, lawful gun owners saw something close to efficiency from a federal agency. Reports poured in from dealers across the country. Some customers were receiving approvals within 24 hours of submission. It was revolutionary.
This wasn't deregulation. The requirements of the National Firearms Act of 1934 still applied. Applicants still paid the $200 tax stamp, provided fingerprints, and underwent a full background investigation through the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The difference was that the digital system reduced clerical delays. What once took months now took days, and the process was transparent and traceable. By mid-2024, enthusiasm was spreading through the firearms community. Dealers were selling suppressors faster, manufacturers like Silencer Co., Dead Air Armament, and Gemtech saw record demand, and the ATF's modernization appeared to be an example of government doing something right. Many believed that the Second Amendment community was finally being treated with administrative fairness. Then came the 2025 federal government shutdown, triggered by congressional gridlock over the national budget. Virtually overnight, the same ATF system that had been praised for efficiency went dark. The eForm processing portal was reclassified as a non-essential service. Pending applications froze. Dealers couldn't transfer legally purchased items. Customers who had paid in full were left waiting, sometimes with thousands of dollars tied up in inventory they couldn't touch. This wasn't a minor delay, it was a complete halt. Even though the NFA division is funded primarily through user fees rather than tax dollars, the shutdown treated it as if it were a discretionary program. The absurdity was hard to ignore. Americans had paid the federal government to perform a service, and that same government refused to process it. Within days, firearm forums and NFA tracking communities began to light up. People posted screenshots of their frozen eForms, venting frustration and disbelief. Some dealers even reported that their systems had accepted payment for the tax stamp before abruptly halting approval notifications. For many, this felt more than bureaucratic mismanagement. It was a reminder of how easily administrative power could restrict lawful exercise of rights. The ATF offered no clear explanation at first. Applicants were told to wait. The shutdown had created a backlog of millions of forms, each one representing a citizen who had complied with the law but was still left in limbo. And this wasn't just an issue for consumers, it hit businesses hard. Firearm retailers rely on steady NFA processing to sustain revenue. With every week of delay, small shops faced serious losses. The irony was painful. A year earlier, the ATF had been applauded for modernizing its system. Now, that same technology was proof of how fragile administrative efficiency really was. When politics stepped in, progress vanished. The moment the ATF labeled NFA eForm processing as a non-essential service, the message was clear. Even law-abiding gun owners could find their constitutional rights paused, not by a court, not by Congress, but by an unchecked bureaucratic decision. It was the digital equivalent of locking the door on compliance.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, doesn't exist to create law. It exists to administer the laws passed by Congress, particularly the National Firearms Act of 1934 and the Gun Control Act of 1968. These are statutes, not policies. They mandate how certain firearms are registered, taxed, and approved for transfer. When ATF halted the processing of NFA applications, it didn't just pause a service, it paused compliance with federal law. That's why this decision raises serious Fifth Amendment and Second Amendment questions. Under the Fifth Amendment, citizens are entitled to due process when interacting with the federal government, especially when exercising a right recognized by law. And under the Second Amendment, the government cannot infringe upon the right to keep and bear arms. By labeling NFA processing non-essential, the ATF indirectly denied both. It withheld due process and obstructed lawful firearm ownership. What makes this situation even more concerning is that the NFA division operates largely on user-paid fees, not congressional appropriations. Every NFA application includes a $200 tax stamp, directly funding the system that processes it. Yet despite that self-sustaining structure, ATF administrators treated it like a taxpayer-funded discretionary program. That's a dangerous precedent. If the government can shut down a fee-funded service on a whim, it can effectively suspend access to any right it regulates, whether it's gun ownership, licensing, or even free speech activities requiring federal permits. Businesses felt the pain immediately. Licensed firearms dealers, FFLs, were left holding inventory they couldn't legally transfer. Small suppressor manufacturers saw thousands of pending sales locked in limbo. For companies like Silencer Shop, Dead Air Armament, and Surefire, this wasn't an abstract policy debate, it was a sudden economic freeze. And for customers who had already passed background checks, paid for products, and complied with the law, it felt like a betrayal. Meanwhile, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, NSSF, stepped in fast. They began lobbying members of Congress and communicating directly with ATF leadership, arguing that the NFA division's operations were essential under federal law. Within days, their pressure paid off. The ATF quietly reclassified NFA processing as essential. Operations resumed, but not without lasting damage. The shutdown created a massive backlog of pending applications. What had been a 24-hour approval process before the shutdown now stretched into weeks. Some dealers reported months-long delays. The efficiency that once symbolized a rare victory for lawful firearm ownership had been erased by bureaucratic mismanagement. This incident serves as a stark reminder. Constitutional rights can be undermined not just through new laws, but through the quiet inaction of existing agencies. The ATF didn't need to pass a new regulation or seek congressional approval. It simply paused its duty. And in doing so, it exposed how fragile the administration of the Second Amendment can become when the government treats it as a matter of convenience rather than principle. That's why what happened during the 2025 shutdown should concern every law-abiding gun owner in America. It wasn't just about suppressors or tax stamps, it was about precedent. When government agencies can choose when to enforce the law, the rule of law itself is at risk.
When the ATF's NFA eForm system finally came back online, there was a collective sigh of relief across the firearms community. But relief quickly turned into frustration. The once lightning-fast approval process was now crawling again. Instead of 24-hour turnarounds, applicants were waiting weeks, sometimes months, for updates. The system that had represented efficiency and modernization was now another symbol of bureaucratic dysfunction. The cause wasn't just technical, it was structural. During the shutdown, key personnel from the NFA division were reassigned or furloughed. The backlog that formed during those 2 weeks was massive, and clearing it would take months. Dealers, manufacturers, and law-abiding citizens bore the brunt of it, even though they had followed every rule and paid every fee. But beyond the inconvenience, the episode raised deeper questions about the stability of our rights under administrative control. If the ATF can pause NFA processing by calling it non-essential, what's to stop future shutdowns or politically motivated administrators from doing the same? It's a slippery slope that could easily extend beyond suppressors and SBRs to other areas of firearms regulation. For example, if a future administration decided to deem concealed carry reciprocity reviews, firearm import authorizations, or even background check services as non-essential, the entire firearms industry could grind to a halt. These are not far-fetched hypotheticals, they're plausible scenarios under the current legal framework. The 2025 shutdown exposed a gap in how essential government services are defined and the consequences of that ambiguity. This is where advocacy organizations play a crucial role. Groups like the National Shooting Sports Foundation, NSSF, Gun Owners of America, GOA, and the Firearms Policy Coalition, FPC, serve as watchdogs for lawful gun owners. Their rapid response during the shutdown proved that active engagement and lobbying matter. Without NSSF's intervention, the ATF might have left the eForm system offline indefinitely. But advocacy alone isn't enough. We need legislative clarification to ensure that firearm-related administrative functions are permanently classified as essential federal services. Congress should codify that agencies like the ATF cannot suspend operations related to lawful firearm transactions during budget impasses. Similar protections already exist for critical financial and security sectors. There's no reason the exercise of constitutional rights should be treated with less importance. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, but rights require mechanisms for lawful exercise. If those mechanisms, background checks, tax stamps, and registrations, can be switched off at will, then the right itself becomes conditional. That's not how constitutional governments is meant to operate.
There's also a broader lesson here about civic engagement. The firearms community can't rely solely on organizations to fight these battles. Individual gun owners need to stay informed, speak out, and support legal challenges when necessary. Bureaucracy thrives in silence, and when people stop paying attention, administrative overreach becomes the default. For every gun owner who waited weeks to pick up a suppressor or SBR, this shutdown was a wake-up call. It reminded us that freedom isn't lost in one dramatic stroke, it's chipped away quietly, one non-essential label at a time. The only way to prevent that is through awareness, advocacy, and legal reform. So as we move forward, the priority should be clear. Push for laws that guarantee continuity in firearm-related services, demand accountability from agencies like the ATF, and remind every public official that constitutional rights don't depend on political convenience. Because when the next shutdown comes, and history shows it will, we can't afford to have our rights shut down with it. In the end, the 2025 federal government shutdown did more than just pause a few background checks. It exposed how fragile the administration of our rights has become. For 2 long weeks, millions of Americans were left waiting, unable to complete lawful firearm purchases, not because of a new law or regulation, but because a federal agency decided their rights were non-essential. That phrase alone should concern every citizen who values liberty. The National Shooting Sports Foundation, NSSF, deserves credit for stepping up quickly, lobbying the ATF and Congress to restore NFA eForm processing as an essential service. Their actions prove that advocacy works, but they also revealed a dangerous reality. Our system relies too heavily on discretion rather than legal obligation. The ability to exercise a constitutional right should never hinge on administrative priorities. As a lawful gun owner and firm believer in the rule of law, I see this episode as a clear warning. We must push for permanent legislative protection that ensures firearm-related processes remain operational under all circumstances. The Second Amendment cannot function if the pathways to exercise it can be turned off like a light switch. So as we move forward, the message is simple. Vigilance is not optional. We need lawmakers who understand that constitutional rights don't pause when the government does. Because the next time Washington shuts down, our rights must not shut down with it. Respect the law, protect your rights, and remember, freedom demands responsibility.